Are we living in a simulation? Maybe, maybe not. However, I'm fairly convinced that we will soon be creating realities that rival our own, and in this video, I will present some examples of the simulations we'd be motivated to create with technology on the near horizon, and convince you that all of this is at least possible. There have been a lot of prominent figures recently that have speculated that we're in a simulation, including Neil deGrasse Tyson and Elon Musk. There are a lot of compelling reasons to suspect that this is the case, but one of the more convincing arguments is that as we continue to build our own simulations, the probability that we're in a simulation ourselves approaches 1. This video is my attempt to inspire you to think more about this topic and generate more conversation around the topic. I won't be exploring the question of whether we ourselves are in a simulation, but I plan to make a number of videos on the topic of simulation hypothesis going forward, as I find it interesting and consider it to be somewhat useful for guiding our exploration of the future. I first wanted to give credit to the two primary sources of inspiration for this video: the Lex Fridman interview with Nick Bostrom, and a video by Isaac Arthur titled The Simulation Hypothesis. Both are excellent resources and I recommend checking both of them out, so I linked them in the description. If you've already seen my other videos, you may have noticed that so far this channel has focused on what I consider to be the near future, and this video is no different. I expect most of the things discussed in this video to happen within the average viewer's lifetime, if not much sooner. This video is intended to lay the foundation for ideas discussed in future videos though, and I hope you subscribe so you don't miss those ones. Feel free to use the timestamps in the description to skip ahead if you'd like. I placed the potential simulations discussed in this video in two buckets: the more classically discussed Ancestor simulations, as well as what I refer to as contemporary simulations. Ancestor simulations, as the name suggests, are typically simulations of scenarios in the past from the reference point of the parent reality. I've coined the term contemporary simulation to represent anything that is in the present or future of a parent reality, for lack of a better term, at least to my knowledge. There's a bit of overlap between these two categories, but I think it's worth drawing a distinction between them. The upcoming chapters could very well describe simulations from either category, so keep that in mind. Note that this entire video is based on hypotheticals, so there is no guarantee that these hypothetical scenarios will actually occur in the future. I'm optimistic though, and I feel sufficiently motivated to pursue bringing these hypothetical scenarios to life at some point in my future career path, given the necessary resources and time. Let's start by talking about some of the potential reasons why someone might create Ancestor simulations, starting with a type of Ancestor simulation you've probably already participated in: video games. Minecraft, Fortnite, GTA 5, and Skyrim are all examples of experiences that resemble the simulations we're talking about to a certain degree. Of course, right now there's nothing in video games even remotely resembling real human-level consciousness, but I wouldn't be surprised if we started seeing NPCs, that is, non-playable characters, get close to something resembling consciousness within the current decade. Note that I specifically said resembling and made no assumption of actual consciousness. The only strict requirement here is to fool an observer into thinking that someone is conscious, which likely can be done without whole brain emulation. Additionally, over the decades, graphical quality, shading, lighting, and animations have continued to improve thanks to things like physically based rendering, ray tracing, and motion capture. Machine learning will continue to further improve upon graphical fidelity with techniques like AI upscaling, AI-based photorealism filters, and reinforcement learning. Conversational AI is getting more and more sophisticated thanks to large 100 billion plus parameter transformer models like GPT-3. And soon we'll likely see chatbots whose conversational ability is nearly indistinguishable from that of humans for all practical purposes. Video games are likely to continuously improve in their level of fidelity and accuracy over time, and NPCs and other agents within games will improve in their ability to convince you that they are in fact conscious. And we probably don't have to really simulate an entire human brain or every atom on the planet in order to make a convincing simulation if the goal of an NPC is to fool a human into believing that it's real. Video games today stream in higher detail models and textures the closer you get to an object, with Unreal Engine 5 improving upon this even more with technologies like Nanite. We have a wide range of procedural games that generate repeatable game maps and assets using seed numbers and formulas. Basic NPC animations and dialogue could be replaced with more sophisticated variants once you're focusing on the NPC and interacting with them, since the conversational element could be as simple as an API call to something like OpenAI. It could even be conceivable that the reality that we're perceiving is in fact one of these video games. You as the viewer, I as the video creator, or both of us could be an NPC in such a simulation. Or any number of us could be real players that just happen to have some sort of memory suppression in place. As I've mentioned already, I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other that we ourselves are in a simulation, but instead that the scenario I've described is plausible. If you're an NPC, you don't need to be truly conscious to convince a real player that you're conscious. In a similar vein, if you're a player, you don't need to have your entire brain simulated if you're participating in the simulation using immersive enough VR. Speaking of VR, I want to talk a bit about a thought experiment called the experience machine. The idea was proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick in a 1974 book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. In this thought experiment, you have a machine that's able to replicate any desirable or pleasurable experience a subject could want. The subject could choose to plug themselves into this machine at will and as often as they'd like. While the purpose of the thought experiment is a criticism against hedonism, let's talk about the fact that this sounds very much like the long-term goals of virtual reality. Complete immersion in a virtual world that is indistinguishable from base reality. In such an experience machine, you could replay historical events or any imagined fictional event in the past, present, or future, and you could share this virtual world with other players. With sufficient advances in technology, one could imagine ways to essentially change the time perception for a digital version of a human brain to experience a long period of time in a very short amount of real time. If this is the case, you could potentially experience hundreds or thousands of human lifetimes if you wanted to, which kind of aligns with the idea of reincarnation. In fact, this could be a plausible implementation of the plot of the short story called The Egg, wherein a person reincarnates into every single human across the span of human history in random sequence. How could we build our own experience machine? Well, we've already started the process thanks to the advances made in the past decade in the field of virtual reality. VR has been a fantasy of engineers and gamers for decades, but it became a practical reality when Palmer Luckey started creating prototypes in his parents' garage in 2010 and eventually went on to found the VR company Oculus, now a part of Facebook Reality Labs. The VR industry is booming and isn't stopping anytime soon. Visual fidelity continues to increase, and immersion keeps improving as we develop better tracking, imaging, and rendering techniques. We can continue improving our sense of touch through haptic feedback in bodysuits, and we even have the technology to stimulate the sense of smell as well. I think that at some point, external VR headsets will be replaced entirely by BCIs like Neuralink, which could potentially write signals for the various senses directly to the human brain. In fact, Valve founder Gabe Newell has recently announced a partnership with OpenBCI tackling this very challenge. If we wanted the participants of an experience machine to be unaware of the fact that they're in a simulation, we could even manipulate their brain in such a way as to suppress their memories of base reality and restore those memories afterwards. The Matrix is probably a good example of this type of simulation taken to an extreme, where everyone is physically plugged in and fully immersed in a virtual world against their will in a way that completely replaces base reality. Could we possibly be in such a simulation already? I'll keep my eye out for glitches in the Matrix and let you know if I find any. And if some shady person offers you a choice between a red pill and a blue pill, I'd probably take the red one, but consult with your doctor first. I recently watched the new Marvel show What If, which explores some alternative timelines in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where key events throughout the MCU happened differently. This is a common trope in a lot of stories involving time travel. And while time travel to the past is generally considered infeasible, we could just simulate the act of going back in time and changing events instead. What if you wanted to simulate a world where nuclear war led to mutually assured destruction and most of humanity died out, or where Archduke Franz Ferdinand wasn't assassinated and World War I wasn't triggered as a result? How would life evolve if Earth gravity were 30% higher? Given sufficient computation or a clever procedural generation, you could see how these sorts of scenarios could be sufficiently explored. In order to simulate events with a high degree of accuracy, one would have to simulate complex human interactions, socioeconomics, religion, political systems, and possibly even consciousness itself. This is likely to be a much longer running simulation than those you'd encounter in a video game or experience machine, and if I were to speculate about whether we ourselves are in a simulation, I'd say that this is the most likely candidate for our use case or our so-called purpose, but I digress. Let's switch topics a bit and talk about contemporary simulations. As I mentioned before, this is a term I made up to differentiate ancestor simulations, which are by definition limited to past events, from simulations that are more general and can be applied to any time period. I felt it was necessary to make this distinction, as a lot of simulation hypothesis discussion is focused on computation and simulation that is many orders of magnitude more complex than anything resembling our current technology. But as I pointed out in this video, there's a more continuous, less binary path to creating our own simulations, and we're already making progress in one specific area of note: machine learning. Machine learning is a pretty broad topic and goes way beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here, and I'll be horribly oversimplifying things to make a point, so please keep that in mind. The human brain is incredibly complex, and we're still only beginning to understand how to architect artificial intelligence systems to achieve the same level of intelligence and understanding. There are three major branches of machine learning: supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning, and training AI systems will likely involve more than one of these techniques. Let's focus on reinforcement learning, which involves learning from past experiences and using this to improve the performance of some agent in the future. This sort of technique forms the basis of decision-making systems like Tesla's full self-driving, which I recently created a video about, so you may wish to familiarize yourself with some of the basics using that video. While you're at it, I recommend watching my video about Tesla bots as well, as I'll be tying these two concepts together here. In both of these videos, I mentioned the use of photorealistic simulations to supplement the real-world training data for autonomous systems. Real-life data is of course the most useful for training these particular AI systems, but certain edge cases and rare events won't be well represented in the training model using only real-life data. For this reason, Tesla has decided to create simulations that function somewhat like video games, where the autonomous agent, or in other words, a Tesla car, can interact with a virtual world and use simulated camera data to further train the network. There's motivation to improve the accuracy of the simulated camera data by applying filters that match real-life conditions like fog, rain, and snow, and the more pixel-perfect accuracy you have, the better. Once Tesla bots are walking around in the real world collecting training data, you could imagine that the complexity of training a model for general-purpose humanoid robots would be orders of magnitude more complex, perhaps even to the point where humans are simulated to a degree of intelligence bordering on consciousness. Given high enough fidelity, we've essentially created a set of virtual humans all interacting with each other simply to train a neural network. Would these simulations ever need to be complicated enough to rival our own reality? Perhaps not, but it's nevertheless interesting to think about such a scenario. It's worth mentioning that our brains actually do something that seems to be similar whenever we're dreaming. We see events or people from our past, or our brain makes up entirely new ones, and if we're lucid dreaming, we even have a bit of control in shaping our dream reality. I often think about how these dreams are second nature to us at this point, and yet they highly resemble the video games and other simulations we've been striving to create over the last few decades. I think one future application of this technique could be to get around the latency issue when it comes to multiplanetary communication. Talking to someone on the other side of the planet takes round trips on the order of tens to hundreds of milliseconds, but talking to someone on Mars in real time would be impossible due to the speed of light. Sending and receiving a message round trip would take a minimum of 6 minutes and an average of 25 minutes. If we wanted to achieve something similar to real-time communication, we'd probably have to train some ML model to accurately portray our characteristics and interactions with the other person. I'll be making a video on this someday because this is something I absolutely believe will be a useful tool for interplanetary communication. Let me know in the comments if you have thoughts on this, because I'm pretty sure it would be possible to create a practical version of this concept, even with today's technology. This one's admittedly a little out there, but I wanted to give another example of a motivation for a contemporary simulation, so here we go. Given our current understanding of the universe, we predict that our universe will end in a heat death when we've reached a state where we have no possible way to increase entropy. And while that time is way in our future, it's an inevitable existential threat to all life in the universe, human or otherwise. Could this limit have been imposed by apparent reality? Perhaps, but I think the more interesting question is whether we could learn something about our own reality by imposing this limit in simulations. This begs the question, how could we make a simulation that could predict the future of humanity? The collective intelligence of our species is limited by the number of people we have and the amount of compute used to power artificial intelligence, but perhaps the ultimate way to increase the collective intelligence of our species is to create simulations as a sort of sandbox to run in parallel alongside society. These simulations would contain people that are oblivious to their simulated reality, and we'd be able to learn from their own creative thinking and inventions and add that to the collective intelligence and knowledge possessed in our current reality. Following this line of reasoning, you could think of these parallel simulations as hedges against heat death and other existential threats, as knowledge or insights obtained in a child simulation would bubble up to the parent simulation. These child simulations could even spawn their own simulations, and this tree of simulations could continue to recurse until some fundamental limit is reached. I'd love to do a more in-depth video on the topic of these nested simulations, so let me know in the comments what you think about this concept. That's it for this video. Subscribe if you're interested in more videos about simulation hypothesis, as I'll definitely make some more in the future. Next video though will be about augmented reality, so stay tuned for that as well. If you have a suggestion for a future topic, let me know in the comments, and go ahead and follow me on Twitter at FutureOptimus, link in the description. I'll see you in the next one.